The dust storm had been relentless for 3 days, painting the Montana sky a sickly ochre that blotted out the sun and hope alike. In the small homestead at Broken Creek, Patience Valmont stood at the window of her family's failing farm, watching her father shake hands with the stranger in the expensive suit, a handshake that sealed her fate as surely as if she'd been branded. The year was 1875, and the drought that had scorched the Northern Territories for 2 seasons had finally broken the Valmont family. No rain meant no wheat, and no wheat meant no future. Her 3 younger siblings were already showing signs of hunger that tightened Patience's heart like a fist. She was 20 summers old, with hair the color of burnished copper and eyes that had once held the same hope as the frontier itself. "It's done," her father muttered as he stepped back into their modest cabin, unable to meet her gaze. His shoulders, once broad and strong, now curved inward like a question mark. 3 wagons of grain, enough to get us through winter, maybe spring planting too. Patience felt the blood drain from her face. "What's done, father?" her mother's quiet sobbing from the corner answered before he could. Mrs. Valmont clutched baby Thomas to her chest, rocking him mechanically while tears traced clean lines down her dust-caked cheeks. "You're to marry Harlan Whitley," her father said, each word seeming to age him further. "The banker from Helena, he needs a wife and we need grain. You sold me." The words tasted like metal in Patience's mouth. "Like livestock, I saved this family." Her father's fist came down on the rough-hewn table, making the single candle jump. "What would you have me do? Watch your brothers and sisters starve? Watch this land that 3 generations of Valmonts bled for slip away?" Patience stood frozen, her future crystallizing before her eyes. Harlan Whitley was notorious throughout the territory, a man 30 years her senior with a reputation for cruelty and 2 previous wives, both dead before their 25th birthdays. "When," she managed, "you leave at first light." Her father couldn't meet her eyes. "His man is camped by the creek. He'll escort you to Helena." That night, Patience packed her meager belongings by moonlight: a brush, her mother's small mirror, the book of poetry she'd treasured since childhood, and the revolver her grandfather had given her when she turned 16. She tucked the weapon beneath her shawl, knowing Whitley's man would take it if seen. Dawn broke with a crimson streak across the horizon as Patience hugged her sobbing siblings. Her mother pressed a small sachet of dried wildflowers into her palm. "For remembering," she whispered. Her father stood stiffly by the door, his eyes fixed on some distant point. When Patience approached him, he finally looked at her directly. "It was the only way," he said hoarsely. "I know," she replied, though she didn't. "Not really." The escort waiting by the creek was a thin, hard-faced man who introduced himself only as Silas. He loaded her single bag onto his mule without comment, and gestured for her to mount the spare horse, a bony mare with a dull coat that spoke of poor care. 3 days to Helena," he said, the first and last words he'd speak for hours. They rode west, following the path of the sun. By midday, Patience's childhood home had disappeared behind the rolling hills, and with it, the life she had known. The land changed gradually as they traveled, prairie giving way to scattered pines, then thickening forest as they approached the mountain passes. On the 2nd day, as they made camp in a sheltered grove, Patience overheard Silas speaking to a fellow traveler, a whiskey trader heading east. "Carrying precious cargo for Mr. Whitley," Silas chuckled, nodding toward where Patience sat by the small fire. "Cost him 3 wagons of grain, droughts driving prices up, women and wheat alike." The trader laughed. "Whitley drives a hard bargain. Last I heard, he paid 5 wagons for that French girl. Course, she didn't last the winter." Patience felt ice form in her chest. That night she lay awake long after Silas began snoring, her hand on the revolver beneath her blanket. She could run, but to where? The wilderness held as many dangers as Whitley's mansion, and her family would suffer if she disappeared. The grain might be reclaimed, her siblings left to starve. On the 3rd day, as they descended toward a valley, a shot rang out, sending birds scattering from the pines. Silas jerked upright in his saddle, reaching for his rifle, when a second shot splintered the saddle horn inches from his hand. "That's far enough," called a voice from the rocks above the trail. Hands where I can see them. Patience watched as a tall figure emerged from the cover of boulders, a man with sun-browned skin and eyes the color of a summer storm. He wore trail dusty clothes and a weathered hat pulled low, but there was nothing weary in how he held the rifle trained on Silas. "This don't concern you, cowboy," Silas spat. "I'm on business for Harlan Whitley." "I know exactly whose business you're on," the stranger replied, his voice carrying a hint of Texas in its cadence. "And I know what kind of business Whitley's in." His eyes flickered to Patience. "Madam, are you traveling of your own accord?" Before she could answer, Silas drew his pistol. The stranger's rifle cracked once, and Silas tumbled from his horse, clutching his shoulder and cursing. "Last chance," the cowboy said evenly. "Drop the gun." Silas let the pistol fall, his face contorted with pain and rage. "Madam?" the stranger asked again, his eyes never leaving Silas. Patience found her voice. "No," she said, "I'm not." The cowboy nodded as if this confirmed something he already knew. He approached cautiously, rifle still trained on the wounded man. "My name's Kieran James," he said, "and I believe we should have a conversation about your current arrangement." "She's Whitley's property," Silas growled. "Paid for fair and square." Something dangerous flashed in Kieran's eyes. "Then you're the harvest I needed," he said, looking at Patience, "because no person is grain to be traded." He bound Silas's wound tightly enough to stop the bleeding, then secured his hands behind his back. "You have a choice, miss," Kieran said to Patience as he helped her down from her horse. "I can take you to the next town, or you can come with me to my ranch. It's a half-day's ride south. From there, you can decide your next move without Whitley's shadow over you." Patience studied the stranger's face, looking for deceit or desire and finding neither. Only a steadiness that felt like solid ground after days of shifting sand. "Why would you help me?" she asked. "Because Harlan Whitley has been buying women like cattle and working men to death in his mines for years," Kieran replied, "and because no one should be sold for the price of grain." Patience made her decision. "Your ranch, then, but I won't be trading one captor for another." Kieran's mouth curved slightly. "No, madam, that's not how I do business." They left Silas tied to a tree with water within reach and his horse tethered nearby. He would free himself eventually, but it would give them a head start. "Whitley will come after her," Silas called as they prepared to leave. "And he doesn't forget those who cross him." "Neither do I," Kieran answered simply. They rode south, following game trails through stands of aspen and pine. Kieran kept a careful distance, speaking little but watching the trail behind them often. As the sun began its descent, they crested a ridge, and Patience saw a valley spread before them, a patchwork of green pastures, golden hay fields, and a cluster of buildings beside a silver ribbon of creek. "Clearwater Ranch," Kieran said. "My father's land, now mine." "It's beautiful," Patience replied, surprised by the scale and prosperity evident even from a distance. This was no hardscrabble homestead, but a thriving operation. "It's had better years," he said modestly, "but we've managed to store enough to get through this drought." As they approached the ranch house, a sturdy two-story structure of squared logs with a wide porch, a young man hurried out to meet them. "Riders coming from town," he called. "4 of them pushing hard." Kieran's expression tightened. "That'll be Whitley's men. Word travels fast." He turned to Patience. "Miss Valmont, this is my foreman, Samuel Cooper. Sam, Miss Valmont needs sanctuary." "Whitley business?" Sam asked grimly. Kieran nodded. "I'll get the men ready," Sam said, hurrying toward the bunkhouse. Patience felt panic rising. "I've brought trouble to your door." "I should go." "You'll do no such thing," Kieran replied firmly. "Whitley doesn't own this valley or the law within it." He dismounted and offered her his hand. "Come inside, you'll be safe here." The ranch house was comfortably furnished, but clearly a bachelor's domain, functional and unadorned. Kieran ushered her to the kitchen where a middle-aged woman was kneading dough. "Mrs. Abernathy," he said, "this is Miss Valmont. She'll be staying with us for a time." The housekeeper wiped her hands on her apron and nodded warmly. "Welcome, miss. Let me show you where you can freshen up." Patience was led to a small but clean bedroom upstairs. Through the window, she could see men positioning themselves around the ranch yard, rifles in hand. Guilt and fear twisted inside her. By the time she descended the stairs, the sound of approaching horses could be heard. Kieran stood by the window, his expression calm but vigilant. "Stay inside," he instructed. "Whatever happens." Through a gap in the curtains, Patience watched as 4 riders entered the yard. Their leader, a sharp-featured man in an expensive black coat, dismounted and approached the porch where Kieran now stood waiting. "James," the man called, "I believe you're harboring property belonging to Mr. Whitley." "I don't see any of Whitley's property here, Malcolm," Kieran replied evenly. "Just my land and my people." Malcolm's thin smile didn't reach his eyes. "The woman, James, Sela's rode into town an hour ago with an interesting tale. Mr. Whitley paid good money for her illegal transaction with her father." "People aren't property," Kieran said, his voice carrying across the yard. "And I don't recognize the legality of selling human beings, no matter what's exchanged." Malcolm's hand drifted toward his holster. "Don't make this difficult. Hand her over and we'll forget your interference." "I'm afraid I can't do that." Malcolm's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Whitley isn't a man you want as an enemy." "Neither am I," Kieran replied, his tone unchanged but somehow more dangerous. "Now you're trespassing on my land. I suggest you leave while that's all you're doing." Patience held her breath as tension filled the yard. Malcolm looked around, noting the ranch hands positioned strategically, all armed and watchful. After a long moment, he remounted his horse. "This isn't over, James." "I expect not," Kieran acknowledged, "but it's over for today." As the riders departed, Patience stepped onto the porch. The setting sun bathed the valley in gold, but she couldn't appreciate its beauty through her growing dread. "They'll be back," she said. "With more men," Kieran nodded. "Probably, but not tonight." "Why risk this for a stranger?" she asked. He turned to face her, his expression solemn. 5 years ago, my sister was sold to pay my father's debts after he died. By the time I tracked her down, it was too late." He looked away toward the distant mountains. "I made a promise then that I'd never stand by while it happened to someone else." Patience felt a connection form between them, the bond of shared understanding that transcended words. "I'm sorry about your sister." "So am I," he said quietly. "Now, Mrs. Abernathy has likely prepared enough food to feed an army. You must be hungry after the trail." Over the next days, Patience learned the rhythms of Clearwater Ranch. Despite Kieran's protests, she insisted on earning her keep, helping Mrs. Abernathy with household tasks and even assisting the cook, a cheerful Mexican man named Miguel, in the kitchen. The work was a welcome distraction from her uncertain future and the threat hanging over them. Kieran kept a careful distance, unfailingly polite but never presumptuous. She often caught him watching her, though, with an expression she couldn't quite define, something beyond concern or curiosity. On her 4th evening at the ranch, she found him on the porch, staring at a letter in his hands. "Bad news?" she asked. He sighed. "The bank in Helena is calling in loans early. Drought's making everyone nervous." "Whitley's bank," Kieran nodded. "He's on the board of directors. Not a coincidence, I'm sure." "Because of me," Patience said, guilt washing over her. "You should have let me go." "That was never an option," he replied firmly. The next morning brought more unwelcome visitors, the county sheriff and his deputy, both looking uncomfortable. "Got a complaint, Kieran," Sheriff Davis said, refusing the offered coffee. "Whitley's claiming you're harboring a woman contracted to marry him, says her father accepted payment." "And you're here to do what exactly, Tom?" Kieran asked, his tone casual but his stance alert. The sheriff sighed, pushing back his hat. "Just looking into it officially. You know I've got no love for Whitley, but he's got influence with the territorial governor." "The lady in question is here of her own free will," Kieran said. "And last I checked, forcing a woman into marriage against her will isn't legal in Montana territory, payment or no." "Mind if I speak with her myself?" the sheriff asked. Patience stepped forward from the doorway. "I'm Patience Valmont, Sheriff. Mr. James is correct. I have no desire to marry Harlan Whitley." The sheriff studied her for a moment. "Your father claims otherwise, miss. Says you agreed to the arrangement." "My father was desperate," she replied, lifting her chin, "and I was given no choice." Sheriff Davis nodded slowly. "That's good enough for me." He turned to Kieran. but it won't be good enough for Whitley. He's not a man who likes to lose. I'm familiar with his character, Kieran said dryly. After the sheriff departed, Patience found Kieran in the barn, saddling his horse. Where are you going? She asked. To see your family, he replied. If we're going to fight Whitley legally, we need to understand exactly what agreement was made. Patience felt her chest tighten. I'll come with you. It could be dangerous. They're my family, she said firmly, and this is my fight. They rode east at dawn the next day, accompanied by Sam and 2 other ranch hands. Kieran set a careful pace, avoiding main trails and keeping watch for pursuit. On the second day, they encountered a family in a broken-down wagon, a young couple with 2 small children, their worldly possessions piled around them. Axles cracked, the man explained, his face drawn with exhaustion. Heading to my brother's place near Fort Benton. Kieran didn't hesitate. We'll help you fix it. They spent half a day repairing the wagon, and Kieran insisted on giving the family provisions from their supplies. When Patience questioned him about the delay, he simply said, My father believed you measure a man by how he treats those who can offer him nothing in return. By the time they reached Broken Creek, Patience's anxiety had grown to near panic. The landscape of her childhood seemed smaller somehow, the Valmont homestead more worn than she remembered after just a week away. Her mother's cry of surprise brought the entire family running from the cabin. Her siblings swarmed around her, their thin faces alight with joy while her parents stood back, her father's expression guarded and her mother's tearful. You've come home, her mother whispered, embracing her. Not to stay, Patience replied quietly. Her father eyed Kieran suspiciously. Who's this? Patience made the introductions, watching her father's face harden as he realized why they had come. You had no right to interfere, he said to Kieran. The agreement was legal and binding. Was it? Kieran asked mildly. I'd like to see the contract. Inside the cabin, her father reluctantly produced a document, which Kieran read carefully. This isn't a marriage contract, he said finally. It's a labor agreement. It states that Miss Valmont agrees to work in Mr. Whitley's household for a period of 7 years in exchange for the grain delivered. Whitley said it was a marriage arrangement, her father insisted. Then he lied, Kieran replied. And even as a labor contract, it's unenforceable without Miss Valmont's signature, which is notably absent. Patience felt a surge of hope, quickly tempered by her father's next words. Whitley's men came 3 days ago, he said heavily. Said if Patience doesn't return, they'll take back the grain with interest. We've already used some to plant the north field. So that's why you sold your daughter. Kieran's voice was quiet but carried an edge that made her father flinch. For seed grain, for survival, her father shot back. You have no idea what it's like watching your children go hungry night after night, knowing the land that should sustain them has turned against you. Kieran's expression softened slightly. Actually, sir, I do know. My family faced the same drought you're facing now. But there are always other options. That night, after her siblings were asleep, Patience sat with Kieran and her parents at the kitchen table. The lamplight cast long shadows as they discussed possibilities. I can offer you a loan, Kieran said. Enough to repay Whitley and get you through until harvest. Her father's pride bristled. We don't take charity. It's not charity, Kieran countered. It's an investment, 7% interest repayable after harvest, better terms than you'll get from any bank. And if we can't repay, then we renegotiate, Kieran said simply, but it will never involve selling your daughter. Her mother reached across the table and grasped Kieran's hand. Why would you do this for strangers? Kieran glanced at Patience. Because no one should have to make the choice you were forced to make. In the morning, they drafted a formal loan agreement. As her father signed it, Patience saw something like relief in his eyes, though his words remained gruff. I did what I thought necessary, he told her as they prepared to leave. I know, she replied, but I can't stay, father, not yet. He nodded stiffly. That cowboy, he looks at you like you're worth more than all the grain in Montana. Patience felt her cheeks warm. He's a good man. Better than me, you mean. Different, she corrected. Shaped by different circumstances. Their journey back to Clearwater Ranch was tense with vigilance. Twice they spotted riders in the distance and changed course to avoid them. When they finally crested the ridge overlooking the valley, Patience felt an unexpected sense of homecoming, but the peace was short-lived. As they approached the ranch house, they saw signs of trouble: the bunkhouse door hanging askew, windows broken in the main house. Kieran drew his rifle. "Stay back," he ordered, but Patience ignored him, spurring her horse forward alongside his. They found Mrs. Abernathy in the kitchen, applying a cold compress to Miguel's swollen face. "Whitley's men," she explained grimly. "6 of them. They tore through the place looking for Miss Valmont. When they didn't find her, they took some of the horses and said they'd be back." "Anyone else hurt?" Kieran asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Young Jamie took a beating when he tried to stop them from the horse barn. He's resting upstairs." Kieran paced the kitchen, his expression dark. "This can't continue. Whitley won't stop until he gets what he wants or is forced to back down." "Then we make him back down," Patience said firmly. That evening, they gathered around the dining table: Kieran, Patience, Sam, and several of the senior ranch hands. The plan they formed was bold but dangerous. "Whitley's power comes from fear and money," Kieran explained. "We need to undermine both." The next day, Kieran rode to neighboring ranches, calling in favors and alliances. Patience accompanied him, watching as he built a coalition of support ranchers who had their own grievances against the banker, merchants tired of his stranglehold on local business. At the Sullivan Ranch, 20 miles west, they found unexpected allies. Mary Sullivan, a formidable widow who ran the spread since her husband's death, listened intently to their story. "Whitley foreclosed on the Peterson place last year," she said, pouring coffee for them. "Poor Margaret Peterson hung herself rather than be turned out with her children. I've been looking for a way to bring that man down ever since." "We're not looking for violence," Kieran clarified. Mary's smile was wolfish. "Of course not, but a show of force can prevent violence, Mr. James. My boys and I will ride with you." By the time they returned to Clearwater, word had spread. Ranchers and their hands began arriving, setting up camp in the pastures. Patience watched in amazement as the coalition grew: 30 men, then 50, then nearly 100. "I never expected this," she told Kieran as they stood on the porch, watching new arrivals. "The territory's changing," he replied. "Men like Whitley represent the old way: rule by money and fear, but out here, people are building something different. Communities where a person's worth isn't measured by their wealth or power." Patience studied his profile, seeing the conviction in his features. In the week she'd known him, Kieran James had appended everything she believed about men and their motives. Here was someone who fought for principles, not profit, who saw her as a person, not a possession. "You could have walked away," she said softly. "This isn't your fight." He turned to face her, his eyes serious. "It became my fight the moment I saw you on that trail. Some things a man can't turn away from without losing himself." The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken feelings. For a moment, Patience thought he might reach for her, but a call from the yard broke the spell. Riders coming, flying the Whitley brand. The confrontation they'd been preparing for had arrived. Kieran stepped off the porch, Patience beside him, as 15 riders approached the ranch. At their head rode Harlan Whitley himself, a corpulent man with cold eyes and an expensive suit that looked ridiculous on horseback. He reined in, surveying the assembled force with evident surprise before his gaze settled on Patience. "So this is where my property has been hiding," he said, his voice oily with false charm. "I belong to no one, Mr. Whitley," Patience replied clearly. Whitley's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Your father accepted payment, girl. In the eyes of God and the law, that makes you mine." Kieran stepped forward. "That's where you're wrong on both counts. We've examined your so-called contract. It's neither a marriage agreement nor legally binding without Miss Valmont's consent." "Details?" Whitley dismissed with a wave. "The fact remains I provided grain to her family in exchange for her service." "And you'll be repaid," Kieran countered, "in full with interest. I've already arranged it with Mr. Valmont." Whitley's composure slipped momentarily. "This doesn't concern you, James." "I've made it my concern," Kieran replied evenly, "as have all these people." He gestured to the gathered ranchers. We're tired of your methods, Whitley. The foreclosures, the predatory loans, the buying and selling of people. You dare accuse me, we more than dare, called Mary Sullivan, riding forward. We have proof. Letters, accounts, witnesses. Enough to interest not only the territorial governor but federal authorities as well. This was the gambit they'd prepared, a bluff built on fragments of truth. They did have evidence of Whitley's misdeeds, though perhaps not enough for a conviction. But Whitley didn't know that. The banker's face flushed deep red. You're making a grave mistake, all of you. I have connections in Helena, in Washington, so do we, Kieran interrupted. But more importantly, we have each other. He stepped closer to Whitley's horse. Here's what's going to happen. You'll accept repayment for the grain you provided to the Valmonts. You'll cancel the early call on loans to ranchers affected by the drought. And you'll cease your practice of acquiring women through coercion or purchase. Or what? Whitley sneered. Or we'll ensure that every territory newspaper receives documentation of your activities. I imagine your banking partners back east would be most interested to learn how you conduct business on the frontier. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Whitley's face. He looked around at the assembled ranchers, all watching him with grim determination. This isn't over, he said finally. It can be, Kieran replied. Walk away from Miss Valmont, conduct your business honestly from now on, and we'll have no quarrel with you. Whitley's eyes narrowed as he considered his options. Finally, he jerked his head in a curt nod. I'll accept repayment for the grain, but I won't forget this interference, James. I wouldn't expect you to, Kieran said calmly. As Whitley and his men rode away, a cheer went up from the gathered ranchers. Patience felt a weight lift from her shoulders, a burden she'd carried since the moment her father struck his bargain. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night. Ranchers and their families gathered around bonfires, sharing food and stories. Patience moved among them, accepting congratulations and words of support with growing confidence. She found Kieran sitting alone on a fallen log at the edge of the gathering, watching the festivities with a small smile. You did this, she said, sitting beside him. You built this alliance. He shook his head. They were ready for it. Whitley and men like him have been squeezing these families for years. All they needed was a catalyst. Is it really over? She asked quietly. With Whitley, probably not entirely. Men like him don't change overnight. But he'll be more careful now, knowing people are watching. Kieran turned to look at her. What will you do now? Return to your family? The question hung between them, weighted with unspoken possibilities. I'm not sure I can, she admitted. Not yet, too much has changed. You're welcome at Clearwater for as long as you wish, he said carefully. Patience gathered her courage. And if I wish to stay indefinitely, something kindled in his eyes, hope mingled with caution. I'd say that depends on your reasons for staying. Perhaps I've found something worth staying for, she replied softly. Someone who sees me as more than a commodity to be traded. Kieran's hand found hers, his touch gentle but sure. From the moment I saw you on that trail, I knew you were someone extraordinary, Patience Valmont. Not because of your circumstances, but because of how you faced them with courage and dignity. You saved me, she whispered. No, he corrected. I merely provided an opportunity. You saved yourself by choosing to fight rather than submit. The firelight played across his features, highlighting the earnestness in his expression. Patience felt something unfurl within her, a tender shoot of feeling taking root where fear had reigned. I don't know what happens next, she confessed. Neither do I, he admitted. But I'd like to find out if you're willing. His hand tightened around hers, an anchor in the shifting landscape of her life. And for the first time since leaving her family's homestead, Patience felt not just safe but hopeful, as if the harvest ahead might yield something far more precious than grain. The weeks that followed brought changes to Clearwater Ranch. Patience found herself settling into a rhythm, learning the operations of the cattle business and contributing her own skills. The respect she earned from the ranch hands and neighboring families came not from her connection to Kieran, but from her own efforts. Mrs. Abernathy took her under wing, teaching her the management of a large household. This place has needed a woman's touch since Mr. James Sr. passed, she observed. Too many men with mud on their boots and nowhere to wipe them, Patience laughed. I'm not the mistress of Clearwater, Mrs. Abernathy? The older woman gave her a knowing look. Not yet, perhaps. Her relationship with Kieran evolved gradually, built on mutual respect and growing affection. Their evenings often found them on the porch, talking until the stars wheeled overhead. He told her of his childhood, of learning ranching from his father and bookkeeping from his mother, of his dreams for Clearwater's future. In turn, she shared stories of her family the good years before drought came, her mother's gentle wisdom, her father's pride in his land. I should visit them, she said one evening in late summer. See how the crops are faring. Kieran nodded. I'll ride with you. The journey to Broken Creek revealed a transformed landscape. Summer rains had come at last, turning the prairie green again. The Valmont homestead looked revitalized, with promising wheat standing tall in the fields. Her family greeted them warmly, even her father, whose gruff manner had softened somewhat. Crops looking good, Kieran observed as they walked the fields with Mr. Valmont. Should be a strong harvest. Enough to repay your loan, her father replied, with interest as agreed. I'm glad, Kieran said simply. That evening after dinner, Kieran asked to speak privately with her father. They walked to the edge of the property, their silhouettes outlined against the sunset. Patience watched from the porch, her heart racing with anticipation. When they returned, her father's expression was unreadable, but he clasped Kieran's hand firmly before turning to her. This man has asked for my blessing, he said gruffly. I've given it, though I suspect you'd proceed without it if you chose. Patience felt her breath catch as Kieran approached and knelt before her. Patience Valmont, he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. I once told you that you were a harvest I needed. I meant it then as a statement of your worth as a person, not a possession. But I've come to see that you're also a harvest of hope in my life, something precious and unexpected that grew from difficult ground. He took her hand in his. I'm asking if you'll be my wife, not because of any agreement or obligation, but because I love you and want to build a life with you. Tears blurred her vision as she looked at the man before her, this honorable, steadfast cowboy who had risked everything for a stranger and then given his heart to the woman she became. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I will. The wedding took place at Clearwater Ranch as autumn painted the valley in golds and crimsons. Ranchers from across the territory came to celebrate, along with the Valmont family and even Sheriff Davis, who joked that he was attending officially to ensure no one was being coerced. Patience wore a dress of ivory silk that Mrs. Abernathy and her mother had worked on together, with wildflowers in her copper hair. Kieran waited for her beneath an arch of twisted branches, looking both nervous and jubilant. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. As they exchanged vows, Patience thought of the journey that had brought her here, from a woman being sold for grain to a bride choosing her own path. I promise to see you always as you are, Kieran vowed, never as something to be possessed but as someone to be cherished. And I promise to stand beside you, she replied, as your equal partner in all things through whatever harvests may come. The celebration lasted long into the night. At one point, Patience found herself dancing with her father, who looked uncomfortable in his best shirt but determined to do right by his daughter. I failed you, he said abruptly as they moved across the packed earth of the ranch yard. Selling you like that there's no excuse. Desperation drives people to terrible choices, she replied gently. I've forgiven you, father. His eyes glistened in the lamplight. You deserved better. And I found it, she said, glancing toward where Kieran stood talking with her brothers. Perhaps everything happened as it needed to. Later, as guests began departing, Mary Sullivan approached the newlyweds with news. Whitley's leaving the territory, she announced with satisfaction. Seems his partners back east got wind of his methods. They're replacing him with someone from San Francisco. That's welcome news, Kieran said, his arm around Patience's waist. Mary nodded. Thought you'd want to know your stand made a difference, not just for yourselves but for a lot of folks around here. As they stood on the porch of their home that night, watching the last guests depart under a canopy of stars, Patience felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. "What are you thinking?" Kieran asked, drawing her close against the autumn chill. "That sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead us to the best," she replied. "If my father hadn't made that terrible bargain, I might never have found you. I prefer to think we would have found each other somehow," he said. "Some things are meant to be, regardless of the path." She turned in his arms to face him. "Do you really believe that?" "I do," he said with quiet certainty. "Just as I believe that what matters isn't how our story began, but how we choose to write its chapters from here." Patience rose on her toes to kiss him, her heart full of gratitude for this man who had seen her worth when others tried to set her price. "Then let's write something beautiful," she whispered against his lips. Over the years that followed, Clearwater Ranch prospered under their joint stewardship. Kieran's knowledge of cattle and Patience's talent for organization proved a formidable combination. They expanded their operations, invested in new breeding stock, and established a reputation for fair dealing throughout the territory. The Valmont family's fortunes also improved. With the loan repaid and consecutive successful harvests, they added new land and built a proper house to replace the cabin. Patience's siblings visited often, especially her youngest brother Thomas, who showed a keen interest in ranching and spent summers learning from Kieran. In their third year of marriage, Patience gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah, after Kieran's lost sister. 2 years later, twin boys joined the family. Michael and John, their arrivals celebrated throughout the valley. As the children grew, Patience often told them the story of how she and their father met, not the full truth at first, but a gentler version about a brave cowboy who helped a lady in distress. As they grew older, she shared more details, wanting them to understand the values that had brought their parents together. "People aren't things to be bought or sold," she would explain. "Your father knew that when many others didn't. And your mother had the courage to claim her own path when others tried to decide it for her." Kieran would add, on their 10th anniversary, Kieran surprised Patience with a special gift, the deed to a parcel of land adjoining Clearwater Ranch. "What's this for?" she asked, examining the document. "You mentioned wanting to start a school," he reminded her. "For ranchers' children and others who live too far from town. That land has the old Thompson cabin. It could be converted." Patience's eyes filled with tears. "You remembered." "I remember everything you say," he replied with a smile. "It's part of seeing you fully." The school became Patience's passion project. She oversaw its construction and even taught classes herself when qualified teachers were scarce. Children from across the territory attended, some boarding during the week if they lived too far to travel daily. Among her most dedicated students was a young girl named Clara, brought to the school by her uncle after her parents died of fever. Quiet and withdrawn at first, Clara blossomed under Patience's care, eventually becoming like another daughter to the James family. "She reminds me of myself at that age," Patience told Kieran one evening as they watched Clara playing with their children. "Uncertain of her place in the world." "Then she's fortunate to have found you," he replied, "just as I was." As Montana moved toward statehood, Kieran became involved in territorial politics, advocating for laws that protected small ranchers and farmers from the predatory practices they had once fought against. His reputation for integrity earned him respect even from opponents. One autumn evening in 1889, as news arrived that Montana had officially become the 41st state, the James family hosted a celebration at Clearwater Ranch. Friends and neighbors gathered to mark the occasion, including the now elderly Mary Sullivan and Sheriff Davis, long since retired. As twilight settled over the valley, Patience found herself standing in the same spot where Kieran had proposed 15 years earlier. The ranch had grown, with new buildings and fences stretching across land that had been wild when she first arrived. Their children ran among the guests, healthy and confident, secure in their place in the world. Kieran joined her, his hair now threaded with silver, but his eyes still holding the same steadiness that had first drawn her to him. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. James." She smiled at the familiar question. "I was thinking about value," she replied. How easily we mistake price for worth, he nodded, understanding as he always did. Your father thought he was selling you for the price of grain, but you saw something more valuable, she finished. You saw me. The best harvest of my life, he said softly, drawing her into his arms as the first stars appeared overhead. And as their family and friends celebrated around them, Patience knew with absolute certainty that what had begun as a desperate bargain had yielded the richest harvest imaginable, a life built on love, respect, and the freedom to determine her own worth.